My name is Brent Kynoch. I'm the Managing Director of the Environmental Information Association, and I've been asked to speak to you today on preventing asbestos exposure in the home, in the workplace, and beyond. And before I begin that, I just want to share with you briefly a little bit about what the Environmental Information Association is all about. And you see our mission statement there below the title of the presentation. We're all about collecting, generating, and disseminating information about environmental issues in buildings. And we use the word multidisciplinary membership because our membership consists of asbestos abatement contractors, laboratories, industrial hygienists, training providers, building owners, government regulators, all around the board. Anybody who has a concern about environmental issues in buildings would be a member of EIA, and our hope is that we can constantly be pushing information out to these members so that they become better informed and become better at the work that they do in removing asbestos from buildings. First of all, in beginning, I would like us all to agree that asbestos exposures are still occurring. We've just heard that from our first presentation about asbestos exposures that continue to occur both in Libby and in New York, but I want to share with you a couple of other things as well. Consider the story of Richard Pullman, a 27-year employee of the National Air and Space Museum of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. This story just broke a couple of weeks ago in the Sunday Washington Post. Mr. Pullman found out in April of 2008 that he has been working around asbestos in the joint compound of drywall for the entire time that he's worked in the museum. He is an exhibit builder, an electrician by trade, and he's been tearing out and installing walls for years. And only in April 2008 did he learn that there's a 1992 asbestos survey of the building that determined that the joint compound in the drywall was indeed asbestos containing, and in fact urged that the material should not be disturbed unless proper procedures were employed. Mr. Pullman, somehow that was never communicated to him or his co-workers. Or consider the children in this exclusive preschool in Washington, D.C., in the suburbs. Children go into this restroom every day, sometimes several times a day, and they wash their hands with that soap. And every time they bump against that asbestos-containing pipe insulation, they get a face full of asbestos. Yes, this school is subject to federal asbestos regulations, and yes, the asbestos should have been properly removed, but it remains there today. Let us also agree on this, and we'll hear this a lot today, I'm sure, but let us also all agree that there is no known safe level of exposure to asbestos. We've been told that for years, but then sometimes we have some other people trying to convince us otherwise. And you see there's no definition in here of exposure to chrysotile versus amosite versus tremolite or chrysotolite as well. All exposures to asbestos are bad, all of them cause disease. That said, there are a number of products in homes that contain asbestos, and we can indeed be exposed in our homes. We've got exterior surfaces of siding and roofing products. We've got pipe insulation. In some cases, people may have old asbestos logs, gas logs in their fireplaces, a number of different materials in homes that can result in asbestos exposure. We also have the possibility of asbestos exposures at work that continue today. But what I'd really like to share with you is to back up and talk about the larger concerns relating to asbestos exposure, because I think if we cannot get back to the source, we really talk about, as was mentioned earlier, kind of secondary responses to asbestos exposures. First of all, we have a very serious problem existing because of the lack of an asbestos ban. We have continuing today a lack of education. We have a dismal enforcement of existing asbestos abatement regulations that's out there that continues to expose not only the workers performing the asbestos abatement work, but also persons nearby. We have the EPA engaging in some research projects that would in fact relax the current asbestos abatement regulations and allow people to demolish buildings with asbestos in place. And then we have a concern over naturally occurring asbestos sites, and I'll get into each one of these in some detail. First of all, in the asbestos ban, the European Union has banned asbestos. Why not in the U.S.? EPA tried to ban asbestos in 1989. However, it was overturned in 1991. In 2007, very recently, the U.S. Senate unanimously passed a ban asbestos bill. However, the language in that was somewhat flawed because it banned asbestos products containing more than 1% asbestos. The House came back later and introduced a bill that I think was more favorable to any of us involved in the asbestos industry because it involved asbestos-containing products, any products to which asbestos had been intentionally added, although this died and never really went anywhere before Congress changed. However, as long as asbestos is allowed, as long as we are putting asbestos into materials that get into commerce in our country, a legacy of asbestos disease will continue. Materials still not banned. Roofing products. You can go out today and purchase roofing products that contain asbestos. Now, there are those that would argue that this material is well encapsulated and the asbestos cannot be released, but as roofing products dry and age and become weathered by the sun, in fact, there can be significant release, especially if someone goes up to remove an old roof and put a new roof on. Brakes, clutches, and friction products have still not been banned, can still be manufactured and sold in this country. And vinyl tile and the mastics used to apply vinyl tile still are not banned in this country. Education, I talked about a lack of education. EPA's last education document was published in 2007, and they all feel very good about that. This was a document aimed at automotive mechanics and brake workers as well. What I want you to know is that before that, the last guidance document that EPA had published was in 1992. We're getting very little help from EPA on this. I know Margaret has worked very hard to train their workers and their members about the hazards of exposure to asbestos, but we're not getting any help from the EPA. The existing regulations out there are sufficient to protect worker and environmental health, although we just don't see much in terms of enforcing existing regulations. In fact, speaking of enforcement, by the EPA's own admission, their enforcement of existing regulations is dismal. They have a dwindling staff, budgets that don't allow for continuing enforcement of regulations, so persons doing asbestos abatement are in fact being exposed every day, and near standards are being exposed as well. As I said before, the existing regulations are sufficient to protect worker and environmental health, although these budgets continue to be cut, and encouragement, I think, can be pushed downhill, but this is going to take work from all of us. The EPA's research, the Alternative Asbestos Control Method, AACM, previously known as the Fort Worth Method. EPA has conducted 3 experiments since 2006 with the idea of showing that maybe there was a better way to build a mousetrap, and that was maybe there's a way to demolish a building without first removing the asbestos. And let's pray and hope that in fact we can maintain exposures below the permissible exposure limits as well. The results of these 3 experiments actually indicate there is no cost savings involved in doing this work, and in fact there are some very serious cleanup concerns, some asbestos fiber concentrations left behind that are serious. And interestingly enough, a final report on these studies has not yet been issued. There's been some discussion, even as recently as last week, I had some discussions with some folks at EPA about why these studies are not being released. And there's a lot to do with the fact that no one's really sure who's driving the train here. How did this research ever get in place, and how is it that it's being pushed forward and almost coming to regulation where we'll be allowed to demolish buildings with asbestos-containing materials in place, where our federal regulations today require us to first properly remove it. In fact, there's an example of what this alternative asbestos control method is. This was experiment number 1 in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, and you can see the workers applying a firefighting foam to this building as it's being demolished and still contains asbestos material. This is research project number 2. You can see the amount of foam has actually been significantly reduced. And experiment number 3 almost looks like the guy's holding a garden hose on the building now. This is EPA's research project. And in fact, the results of this experiment number 3 show that on the concrete slab, after the work was performed, there were very high levels of asbestos-laden dust that remained, even though this much water was used on the site. I see this as a big problem in terms of exposures. We also have a concern over naturally occurring asbestos. The United States Geological Society released reports of naturally occurring sites in 2006 and 2007. They started with sites on the East Coast, and they've moved across the U.S. And they've done this all from research and paper reviews of mines and other sites which were known to contain asbestos. There's been no movement to provide protection to persons who might come into these sites. In a lot of cases, these sites have been abandoned. There's no fencing, there's no signage, there's no nothing. And very much like what's happened in Libya, we see the opportunity for children and others to go into these sites and to be significantly exposed to high levels of asbestos concentration with no knowledge of the fact that that exists there, unless you get on and you know to go read the USGS report. There's no movement to identify where materials from these mines might have been distributed, and the studies indicate that in fact there should be a very, very deep and grave concern about the naturally occurring asbestos, and some studies have been done right here in California that talk about very significant exposures. How do we prevent exposure? That's really what it's all about today. We can talk about the engineering controls necessary to prevent exposure. We can talk about minimizing the release of asbestos dust, and I think we would all agree about that. But as I said, I want to really focus on the larger picture. I think the ways we work together prevent asbestos exposure: regulate. We need an asbestos ban. We need a ban in place now. We also all need to work together to educate. I know the Environmental Information Association is doing that. I know the AFL-CIO is doing that. We need to encourage EPA to put their resources in place to continue education. You know there's a very serious problem in education. When I can have dinner with friends of mine who say to me, what's the big deal with asbestos? It was banned in the 70s. And they are very interested to learn that in fact it is not. The other thing we can do is participate. You're all here, you're all participants, and we appreciate that, but we need to band together to assure that the regulation and the education occurs, and the only way we can do that is by participating, by holding hands together, and by assuring that we work to prevent exposures in the future. Thank you very much.